With Rise of Skywalker just around the corner, I figured it was as good a time as any to take a retroactive look at the two movies that preceded it. While some movies age like a fine wine, I find that a lot of people see that these movies age more like an egg that became more rotten and foul as the years went by. It was more clear with The Force Awakens because I remember people rejoicing over its release since thank God it was nothing like those monstrosities. Yet as time went by, everyone started to realize just how mediocre the movie really was, and the widespread praise turned into scathing criticism. One of the biggest problems that I can see with the movie is that it matches A New Hope pretty much beat for beat with its story elements. The difference this time being that Rey, unlike Luke, never really seems driven to change. Obviously, she would appreciate a way out of her current situation, but she shows no ambition that would have otherwise been built off-screen before the movie started. When we first meet Luke, he's clearly itching for adventure, he's rash, and he has a few stories or traits or habits that are indicative of his desperate attempt to escape his life as a moisture farmer on Tatooine. Rey, on the other hand, doesn't appear to have that emotional drive, and only has her mind changed once she doesn't have the option to say no. Luke in The Empire Strikes Back has to go out of his way to find Yoda to train his powers, and Rey does this, but TFA makes it clear that she already has the power that she needs to overcome her opponents without training, making the appearance of a teacher seem almost pointless. Come to think of it, Rey reminds me a lot of Brie. Oh no. Oh no. So the main character is boring, which kind of sucks. I've always firmly believed that a good main character makes up for a small majority of what makes a good movie. What really sets both movies and games in stone for me are their fantastic settings and visual themes. A great soundtrack is nice too, but that one's much harder to explain, so I'll pass on over it for now. Anyway, a great example of a movie that fits the well-crafted setting requirement for me is the Grand Budapest Hotel. I'll do a review on the movie eventually, but to summarize the movie, it's bizarre and filled to the brim with fast-paced dialogue and nonsensical situations. The main character, Gustav's character arc, while he was rather creepy, was largely based around how he really only cared about his status. He would risk everything to claim what was entitled to him, but wouldn't give the time of day to the people whom he had nothing to gain from, unless he needed them to do something for him, which ended up being his downfall. Then you have a game like BioShock Infinite that's set in a singular city. Unlike what Skyrim may lead you to believe, cities are huge. The entire game feels unique in each area, and yet everything is still set within Columbia, which is a feat in and of itself. You are confined to Columbia, yet it doesn't feel disconnected from the rest of the world because of the references made and ties that characters have to places beyond the floating city. This is all to say that the sequels are missing, well, they're missing a lot, but ultimately the sequels are missing that feeling of a greater universe. The connections and interactions that the characters in the sequels have are all self-referential and established from prior films. And you know what? I'm just going to come right out and say it. Even the prequels have a greater expanded universe than these films do. They're terribly written films that take themselves far too seriously for what was initially a campy, fun sci-fi action series about space wizards, but at least they have some sense of scale and interconnectivity with other planets. This is all established with one scene in The Phantom Menace, and that same scene repeated more prominently in later installments, the Intergalactic Senate. With this shot alone, the prequels have established that there are ambassadors from dozens of planets across the galaxy, each of which have different appearances, social habits, etc. For me, the sheer number of seats in the seemingly endless Senate Hall suffices enough as evidence that there's a lot more to the Star Wars universe than what we're being presented in the main story. It's totally fine to not show off everything that your galaxy has to offer because it allows us as the audience to wonder and speculate what life might be like on other planets. And when Padme delivers her famous line in Revenge of the Sith,
"So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause."
It makes you that the Senate speaks for hundreds of planets. The decisions and choices here affect billions, if not trillions, of life forms across the entire galaxy. The original trilogy didn't have the luxury of being able to work with massive throne room-esque sets or intense CGI. The final cut of A New Hope even has some continuity and prop placement errors littered throughout its runtime, and most noticeably in Obi-Wan's hovel. Instead, the movies tell a story of an expanded universe and something much greater than what we're being shown on screen through characters exchanging dialogue or set locations. Jabba's palace and the cantina in Mos Eisley, while they're more used to bridge the gap between two acts, have a whole slew of unusual alien characters that all beg questions like, what is that? And where did that thing come from? Once again, just like I explained in my Bioshock example, Star Wars in both the prequel and original trilogy feel like they're showcasing a piece of a much larger pie through visuals and dialogue. The sequels, on the other hand, don't really have that quality. And what makes the movies worse is that they don't really do anything that we haven't seen before in Star Wars. Something that I feel made the Marvel movies really feel special is that each movie they've released introduced us to a new set of characters, expanding on the previously established lore of the movie series. While Star Wars probably shouldn't take the luxury of 20 plus movies to lead up some climactic battle, because having a handful of Jedi fighting will be boring since they all have the same basic abilities, there's nothing new that they bring to the table or experiment with in the two films we have so far. Sure, we have the First Order and the Resistance fighting once again for their political stake on the galaxy, but they're rehashes of the Empire and the Rebellion and nothing more than that. In fact, with the way that Rey interacts with the traitor on Jakku, or how Rose and Finn interact with the gamblers on Canto Bight, you'd almost assume that the rest of the galaxy is largely untouched by and unconcerned with the two relevant parties. Before Obi-Wan, Luke, and the droids drive into Mos Eisley, Obi-Wan warns them that the place is crawling with Imperial spies. Then, when they do arrive, they run into a stormtrooper patrol, further solidifying the fact that yes, the Empire has control even here on this useless sand planet. In the next movie, the rebels have retreated to a secret base on Hoth, a hostile ice planet, meaning that they had a backup plan and were willing to execute on it should they need it, and yet the Empire still tracks them down through the snow and ice. The First Order, however, seems largely unconcerned with Jakku, and although they never had a reason to visit the wasteland of a planet, the Empire having spies on Tatooine in the original trilogy indicates that they still had to take the time to plant people on the planet regardless of its use to them. What I'm saying here is that the First Order's lack of control over Jakku in TFA means that they're either not as powerful as the Empire was, or they're not as dedicated to keeping an iron fist on their domain, which in turn makes them lesser villains and makes it seem like they're one singular organization rather than an intergalactic regime. This is further solidified by, once again, how little concern the planets that we do visit seem to have for the First Order. In fact, I go as far as to say that the gamblers on Canto Bight see the conflict between the First Order and the Resistance as something that they can make money off of that won't really have any long-term impact, given that neither party is or seemingly ever will be in control of their lives. Sure, there were those planets that were destroyed by the Mega Death Star that were supposedly the home planets of the Resistance, but just like Alderaan in A New Hope, we don't really have too much connection to said planets aside from, oh, look out, it's a death beam destroying this thing that this person references one time. The people and aliens that the characters get the chance to interact with, we've seen the likes of before. The settings and interactions are about as inventive as movies like A Good Day to Die Hard, where they mostly rely on wowing you with modern day CGI while making references to prior films in the franchise, which only adds on to how restricted this movie feels. Yeah, the First Order is after this incrementally small resistance, but what are the stakes if neither side has control over the planets that we know about and see in the movies? It's just not enough when the movie says, "This planet was a part of the New Republic, Skaplooey." Because what else do we have to go off of aside from your word? These planets are never developed, and that makes it hard for me to believe that they actually stand for something. And thus, when the planets that we do visit are mostly uninvolved, or the characters we interact with don't care for or are unintimidated by the Resistance or the First Order until one of them shows up and starts pointing a blaster at everyone, it really makes you think about just how small in scale this encounter actually is. That's what's most disappointing about these films. There are these epic space sagas that span a few planets, yet the gravity of the actions of the main characters feel no weight because what they do won't do much to change the lives of other characters we've met so far. We actually see and encounter way fewer aliens in these films, and they're made less of a feature in the films than they ever were. What this change does is it makes all the characters in their travels feel like isolated events, and that's kind of crappy given that the Star Wars universe is an endless sea of untapped potential. Again, compare these events to the likes of what happens in the Grand Budapest Hotel. In the scene where the will of Madame D is being read out, there are a couple dozen other people present at the reading. It wouldn't be unreasonable to believe that all of those present have some relation to Madame D, and especially her son, Dimitri. The only relation that Gustave had to Madame D was far more carnal than anyone else in the room. So when the priceless painting Boy with Apple is handed over to him, the outrage that it incites is justified because Gustave was able to get one of her most envied possessions simply by sleeping with Madame D. If the scene played out the same way with only Dimitri and maybe Jopling present, then the point of the scene, which is the comedy, would have been lost, since it would have seemed like Madame D had a choice between her arrogant son, his hired assassin, and her lover. It may seem insane for me to even think of suggesting such an angle, but when I look back at the last two movies, and especially The Last Jedi, the films feel so empty because all that the characters interact with are characters that are vitally important to the plot of the movie. There are no background characters present to add weight like the rallying speech in A New Hope. There are no weird aliens or unique creatures that add anything aside from scathing, poorly hidden social commentary. While younger Fox may have had a different opinion, I don't watch Star Wars for the Jedi, or lightsaber battles, or fancy space explosions. I watch it because I want to see what new directions the films take and what scale that they can work themselves up to. It's part of the reason why I love Rogue One so much. The characters and settings were the likes of what the Star Wars films had never seen before, and while admittedly it wasn't all that original, I still very much appreciated the way that everything played out while still being contained to the Star Wars universe. The main line of films though, like the prequels, have so much that they could have done, but for different reasons they both fail so spectacularly at highlighting what made Star Wars a standout in the first place. The sequels, while we can argue about the acting or the writing or the cinematography, I think are ultimately missing the galaxy that sets Star Wars apart from the rest. That's all I have for this one. Thanks for watching. Social links are in the description below, and I'll see you on the flip side. Goodbye.